Yes, I will. Chad Washington.
Here.
Bob Van Dyke.
Here.
Christian Rivard.
Here.
Keith Curtis.
Here.
Brand Caparata.
Fran will not be attending today, Andy. She's in the INCASI meeting.
Thank you. Andrew Perky.
Here.
Mark Stern.
Here.
Mark Grandbrenner.
Here.
Jennifer Wycombe.
Here.
Kate Wells.
And Kate
Chris
Wells is
Allen.
joining now.
Oh, thank you for telling me that. Kate Wells, are you present? We'll loop back.
Yes.
Chris
I'm
Allen.
Chris Allen is here.
I got you, Kate. Thank you. Sarah Gregory.
Here.
All right. Well, we do have a quorum, so we can go forward. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you. Hearing a quorum there, I'd like to call recognize we're starting the third official meeting of the Private Force Accord Mitigation Advisory Committee. Welcome to everybody, all the members, and anyone from staff or the public who have joined us as well. I'd like to ask for a motion to approve the agenda, but before anyone does that, I'd like to note that we need to shift the budget update, which was supposed to be the consent agenda. We're going to move to a separate item so that Sarah can offer a couple comments about it. So you may have noticed that we did not have a budget update actually in the consent agenda. Anyway, having said that, will someone move approval of the agenda?
I move to approve the agenda.
Do I hear a second?
I'll second.
Any discussion? Any objections? Okay, hearing none, I consider that agenda approved. So we'll now go to the first agenda item, which is to the consent agenda. The only thing there are the minutes from the last meeting. Would anyone like to offer any amendments or changes to those minutes? Okay, hearing none, I'm without objection, I'll consider the consent agenda minutes approved. We'll now move to the public comment section. Mr. Spurka, did we have any requests for public comment?
We did not.
Okay, very good. If there is anyone in the public, we certainly are eager to receive comment, and the agenda identifies a number of ways to share it, including electronically. So please don't hesitate to share that. Let's go now to the budget update, which was there on the consent agenda, but we'll move now. Andy, are you ready to show those slides from Sarah? Does that work for you, Sarah, to move now to the budget update? Great.
Yes, it does. And I see Andy's slides. Does everyone else see those? Yes, I'm seeing.
Yes.
From Chris.
I do
Okay,
not.
cool.
I do
Thanks.
not. But,
You do not, Bob. Okay.
anybody else missing them there?
They might be popped up on like a off screen, maybe on yours.
Mhm.
You go ahead and I'll try to figure out how to find them.
Sarah, your voice was a little wavery. I don't know if you can be closer to your mic or.
Yeah. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Okay, so apologies for not having some sort of document for you to review in advance. I was just chatting with Bob and Andy this morning, and going forward, we will try to establish some sort of regular budget update for the consent agenda. And we're brainstorming with our budget folks on what that could look like. And we'll keep working on that, knowing that there isn't that much changing right now, as we're not really in spend mode yet. But I will endeavor to do that going forward. But for this update. What I really wanted to do was just follow up on a couple of the questions that were asked at the March meeting. There were two main questions that I can recall. One was, what was the origin of the 67%, 33% split for the administrative positions in the PFA mitigation program? It's 67% general fund, 33% other fund coming out of the PFA mitigation fund. The origin is, I went and looked back and spoke with our budget analysts. I spoke with Sean Clements, checked in with the chairs, and what I'm able to ascertain, having not been their first person, is that that was something that was negotiated during bill drafting. It's my understanding that when positions were being, the list of positions for ODFW, when that was being determined and established, the authors shared that with ODFW, and we suggested that there were additional capacity needs beyond what the authors had originally proposed. And so in order to not have the fiscal be too much of a burden in terms of additional general fund need, the proposal was made that we could get more positions if they were split funded. So that is what ODFW proposed back to the authors, and then it, you know, I'm assuming that maybe this rings a bell for some of you all who were present in the room, but then apparently that is what ended up being adopted by the Legislative Fiscal Office for the bill, for Senate Bill 1501 in the 2022 session. So our understanding is that split was negotiated during bill drafting. And I'll just pause in case there's any follow-up questions and or response to that.
I don't know. Must have been some other bill drafters than me, but that's fine. I mean, like Bob, we were both in the building. Do you recall this conversation?
No, I do not recall that conversation. So that happened someplace I wasn't. Maybe the sort of thing Jason Miner was in, but I'm not sure when.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't recall that either.
So you got three of the architects there. I don't know. I don't know how much it matters. You know, I don't really know which funds, which positions are funded with the industry dollars.
Bob, you're gonna need to mute one of those.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we'll probably just have to dig into this some more. It's fine.
Sarah, how's
My bet is that this is a product of legislative fiscal not wanting to pay for the whole thing, and they put some of it on the PFA fund. But I don't recall any conversation with Stainer or anybody else about having done that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It probably was legislative fiscal making that decision, and we just weren't in that loop. Mark, I think I see your hand raised.
Yes, Sarah, I'm just curious, how is the position currently being funded?
Through that split, it is currently funded at 67% general fund and 33% other fund coming out of the mitigation sub-account. And that is how it is established for permanent funding.
So that's
It's not just one position.
This
right?
biennium as well as going forward at this point.
Correct. It's the two positions, actually. Thanks, Heath. It's Andy's grant coordinator position as well as the staff assistant.
Great.
Yeah, doing my best to try and reconstruct the history on this. Recall that agencies weren't in the room for a lot of the drafting, so I'm reliant to a certain extent on just what the pieces of information I'm able to gather from others. But not unusual for staff and administrative costs to come out of grant funds. That is the case with the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund as well.
Thanks, Sarah. It sounds like there was no one on this call that was in the room during that discussion, so we can follow up offline with further discussion.
Sounds good. The other question, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and Sarah, it is the 67 is the general fund. Is that correct? That's not the
correct.
The smaller shares of PFA. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, yep. The other question was around our what is referred to as limitation or our spending authority. So we're given funds, but then we also have to be given the permission to spend those funds, and that permission to spend those funds is what's referred to as limitation or expenditure authority. And the question that came up last meeting was, can you confirm that the program will have expenditure authority or limitation for available funds next biennium? And the answer is yes. So what is in the governor's recommended budget in terms of limitation is an establishment of 12 million of base program limitation. That means we start next biennium with $12 million in spending authority. And I've got another slide that'll compare like the dollars versus the permission to spend the dollars. And that 12 million will be the permanent base program limitation in every biennium going forward. So that's good. If you recall, back in Senate Bill 1501, we were given the $10 million in general fund, and then the harvest tax process was set up in statute. But we were not given the limitation to spend the funds in Senate Bill 1501. So that was a bit of an oops. And we went back to eBoard in September of 22 and said, can we have permission to spend these funds? And when you go to eBoard, you go in with a detailed spend plan. This is how much we need. This is why we need it. These are the anticipated costs. These are the costs we're anticipating, and they'll grant you that incremental amount of limitation. It's not standard state practice to grant the full limitation when you don't know exactly how or when you're going to spend that yet. It's standard practice to go in and incrementally request based on your anticipated needs or spend plan that you can present to eBoard. So that 2 million base limitation, or that 2 million limitation that we requested in September, does go away at the end of the biennium, but we get a refreshed 12 million in July of 2023. And we can return to request additional limitation as we sort of start to build out, okay, that we know we need X amount for the grant solicitation or strategic grants. We know we have these upcoming administrative costs, and we're going to need more limitation than that 12 million. We can go back and request additional limitation throughout the 23-25 biennium up to that full dollar amount that we have available to us, which will be, if the harvest tax revenue does prove out to be $2.5 million a year, we'll be looking at 25 million. Go ahead, Heath, and Andy, you can go to my next slide.
So I've kind of two questions about that. One is, what do you anticipate the ask will look like to the eBoard? I'm surprised. I heard you say this is standard procedure several times. I don't know how grant programs usually work, but I do seem to recall that the eBoard has a set amount of money that the legislature authorizes them to distribute through their decisions in the interim. Is this amount going to come out of the amounts that the eBoard would otherwise be authorized to spend without the full legislature, or what? And what kind of presentation would you be making to the eBoard? Is this another opportunity for, is this like another review body on the type of projects we're pursuing?
No, it would be simpler than that. It would be I'm just kind of, this is how I would anticipate presenting to them. I would say the Mitigation Advisory Committee has decided that the solicitation going out in October will be 15 million. Therefore, we need an additional, we only have 12 million in limitation right now, so we need an additional 3 million to cover that anticipated grant solicitation. And we have these additional strategic grants that we're seeking to fund up to 1 million, and we have anticipated administrative costs. So our total ask of you, eBoard, is an increase in limitation by 5 million or 7 million.
Well,
or
like, my
wherever,
question is like, what if they just don't do that, right? Like, what if we have a big fire season and the eBoard's soaked? It seems to me there would be some advantage to the agency lobbying for the full limitation right now so that you're not competing for eBoard dollars.
The way my budget analysts describe it to me is that it's a kind of a non-risk request. eBoard does not grant those increases in limitation if you're able to demonstrate your spend plan. If you're able to demonstrate that there is a need and you have a plan in place for the amount that you need and what it's going to go toward, you don't have to specifically say it's going to be for these particular grants, but you have to say it's because we have a solicitation coming up in October and we have decided that the total grant amount is going to be X. So the way the budget analysts describe it to me is that it's not, we're not competing for general fund again in front of eBoard. We're just requesting authority to spend the funds that we have.
And the last question, I guess, is do either OWEB or OCRF have to get eBoard approval for spending?
I'm assuming OWEB, that's a Mark question, I suppose. But OCRF, if we went above what we have available to us in terms of other fund limitation for that program, yes, we would have to go back to eBoard and ask for permission to spend it.
Mark, do you have anything could you share anything there, and then we'll get to you, Chad.
I was just going to say that's my understanding as well, along with if we receive other funding sources and need to get authorization, especially if they're federal. So it's not a process I'm usually involved in but what I've heard described is fairly consistent with my understanding.
Chad.
Thank you, Sarah. Just on this slide here, and maybe you'll offer some corrections or clarification as you present it, but just to clarify, the 33% personnel in the parentheses here, that is not 33% of the 10 million. That's covering 33% of personnel cost out of the 10 million, correct?
Correct.
Great. And then the second bullet point, 2023 through 35, is that meant to be 25?
No, so the total that we'll have for 23-25 is 25. And where it's coming from is the 10 million from this biennium, the 10 million that's in the governor's recommended budget, plus the 5 million in harvest tax revenue, although that harvest tax revenue is going to roll in mid and late in the next biennium.
Right, I understand, Sarah.
Your second line there, Sarah.
The second bullet point.
35, which is maybe a typo.
Oh, yeah. 23-25. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks for catching up.
I would just like to note for everyone here that this is not consistent with the PFA agreement, which was that there would be 10 million per year in general fund available. From my view, it'd be, what would be consistent with the agreement would be having that base budget be 20 million plus the harvest tax revenue should be it's my understanding of the PFA agreement. So I know, I just speaking for myself, of course, here, and not ODFW, I'll be seeking that from in the next governor's budget, that increase, I assume will have to take the form of a POP again for the department, if the department were to support it. Thank you. Other questions or comments on this?
Bob, I'll just say that that's my understanding as well, just for the record.
Okay.
And
Well, go
so
ahead.
sorry, Bob, just a last one. I guess I would really encourage, says you've got a $12 million base program limitation for future biennia. That is to say your continuing service level for this program is $12 million. I think. I don't know for sure what that means. It'd be really great if this $20 million in general fund were rolled up, and if the agency were working aggressively with legislative fiscal to ensure that this is part of your base budget for future years, and we don't have to lobby for independent general fund dollars to support the program. And I think that happens this session for next biennium. That is to say, the budget writers speak to whether it's continuing service level or not now.
So this is, this is where you all in your individual roles probably come in, because as you all know, the governor's recommended budget is the agency's budget at this point. In our agency requested budget, we did recommend that or request that the full 20 million per biennium be permanently allocated so that we would not be competing with ourselves for general fund going forward. And that we also be given the limitation for that. However, that's not what came forward in the governor's recommended budget, so that's now our budget. And in the GRB, it was only allocated as an additional one-time investment of that 10 million. So yes, the funds do roll over, but yes, as Bob said, that is less than the amount that was in the PFA author's report.
Mark, if we can make this our last comment, just for time purposes.
Yeah, just to clarify that the 10 million in 22, 23, that doesn't have to be spent this biennium, and it can roll over into future bienniums. Is that also true with the 10 million that's in the proposed for the next biennium?
It's also true for the harvest tax revenue because it gets deposited into the OCRF subaccount. So then it becomes other fund and it's no longer subject to reversion.
Great, thank you.
Okay, let's, unless there's something urgent, any other pressing comments here? Or Sarah, closing remarks from you on this one?
No, I know we want to move on. Thank you all for the time, and I'm always available if additional questions do come up.
Okay, thank you. Our next topic is the operating procedures. You should have all received a draft of the operating procedures. I'd like to note that there's a little bit less urgency on these than there is for the OARs, because the OARs have a extensive process, public process that has to be gone through to approve them. The operating procedures are really a committee document that we can change anytime by a majority vote. Certainly we would want to give, a chance for public input and consideration of any changes that were going to happen. I'll just start the discussion about these. I think we hoped to approve these today, but as I look over them, they're somewhat, well, they are clearly tied to the OARs. For example, the operating procedures talk about direct funding, and we've changed the nomenclature in the OAR discussion about that. So I think there's just a little bit of rationalization we need, and should probably wait for one more meeting before we approve these till we have the language straight that's connected across the documents. So having said that, I won't be calling for asking for a motion today to approve those, but certainly we do have time now to entertain any kind of comments. If anyone wants to put suggestions for changes, which we can then try to incorporate so that they're ready and consistent with the OARs for next meeting's approval. So having said that, I'll turn it to the committee. Any comments, suggestions, requests for changes with the document that was shared? Mark, please.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I read through them and I thought they looked pretty good. I guess one comment I had, and I did have the opportunity to share this with Bob and Chad and Andy and a couple other people on the committee, but under the duties of the committee, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to pull up my language here.
Mark, as you pull that up, could we ask Andrew Perky to mute your microphone until it's time to speak? There's some background coming through.
There's kind of a general section in the beginning on mitigation advisory committee duties, and I guess if I look down towards the fourth or fifth bullet, it says support opportunities as applicable to leverage funds to obtain additional or matching funding for conservation efforts. And I think this is spot on and something we should all be looking for opportunities as they exist. The bigger thought I had here, or as part of this, and a parallel thought, is that I think we also ought to be thinking about how do we have co-benefits to the work that happens in PFA to other conservation benefits or recreation benefits for the state here. And I guess if I was going to give a simple example, I'd say, suppose we're doing a PFA project that's developing, improving water quality and improving water quality in one of the coastal rivers that has some of the anadromous fish that we're focused on. But maybe that's also a watershed that provides a municipal drinking water for a community there. And I come away thinking that I think we need to be able to recognize those opportunities there and have that be part of our language. Because I think ultimately as this program goes forward, the more we're able to show the multifaceted benefits, I think it will be to everybody's credit. So I had a couple sentences and I read something like support opportunities as applicable, consistent with the PFA, that where available also achieve co-benefits and complementary outcomes for conservation and recreation for all Oregonians. And then a second one kind of along this line, but also recognizing we have a lot of other state programs that are working on similar issues, a general statement that said coordinate opportunities as applicable with other programs within ODF&W, including but not limited to the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund, the Restoration and Enhancement Board, as well as other state agencies, for example, OWEB, ODF, Oregon Water Resources, Parks, and so forth. So my thought is that, again, these are just broad bullets. They're not prerequisites, they're not requirements, but they sort of put it on the table that we'll be aware of and recognizing places where we can coordinate with our partner programs and partner agencies, as well as for projects that have other or multiple benefits in addition to the PFA benefits that we're after. So I guess it'd be a proposal to work on some language to put into that section along those lines.
Well, I'll call on myself here and just say that I did reply to Mark on this, and I agree with him that there's strength to the extent we can get co-benefits from this program and help strengthen the support for the program. My concern is trying to operationalize or add as a criteria something like co-benefits for recreation, for example, how we would do that and how that might actually, in some cases, be in tension with the primary purpose. So I think we could probably get some language that recognizes the desirability of seeking those co-benefits, but I guess I just have a little concern about, again, how to operationalize some of those.
Again, I'm not proposing they're necessary criteria for the grants, but in these broad overviews of the operating procedures for the committee, it's an opportunity to recognize the value there.
No disagreement, Chad. And then let's go to Jennifer. I saw Jennifer, you put a comment in the chat there too.
Bob, I just have a little bit of hesitation around including that as well. I want to make sure that we remain focused on what these grant funds are for and not start to put in rule or in operating procedure things that may be in conflict with that. So, I mean, maybe just illustrating co-benefits in the actual grant applications themselves, and then considering them when we're looking at the the grants, but maybe not putting it into the operating procedures or OARs. Just my thoughts. The other thing is Jennifer has dropped something in the chat here, requesting a terminology change from the term private forest rules and instead saying changes to the Forest Practices Act. I'm okay with that as well. I just do want to make sure that we're all still on the same page around that this is focused on private forests. So as long as we can kind of stay focused on both of those items, that's all I had to say there.
Other comments on the this thought from Mark on the adding language on the co-benefits to other conservation programs and recreation programs? Pete.
Just two comments. One, I thought this was really nicely done. Like the drafting is well done, and I thought it characterizes the MAC such as it is well. In terms of Mark's comment about operating procedures, I think where the rubber probably hits the road is in the scoring. And I suspect you might not want to like have a large score or a meaningful score for those co-benefits to address Bob's and Chad's take. But at the same time, expressing that here may inform our reporting. That is to say, even if you didn't actually have a meaningful change in the overall score for co-benefits, I would hope that in our reporting to the legislature, we illuminated and made some hay of the co-benefits associated with these projects. And maybe in that light, including them here in the operating procedures at this level would be appropriate.
Well, I'm hearing that we should, I think, try to work on some language that recognizes the desirability of those co-benefits, but then in terms of the evaluation criteria and the OARs, take care not to make them requirements of some sort that actually drive the decision making to too great of an extent. Are there any other hands up? Anyone interested in weighing in further here? I guess I suggest that Mark could continue to work with Andy and maybe Chad and I to finesse some language there.
I accidentally raised my hand, but it was just in support of Heath's comment. Include the language, and then we can get into how we assign weight to that when we develop that scoring criteria.
Mark, does that sound like a good path forward for now to work on that a bit more?
Yeah, I think so. And I just want to say, Heath, I agree that I think there'll be a lot of value in being able to talk about the co-benefits and illuminate it when we're talking with potential funders, including the legislature. And I also agree that, we don't want to get into trying to quantify or have them necessarily, how you would score them in a criteria process would be really difficult. But I do think we want to be able to talk about them in our narrative as attributes generated by the program.
Agreed.
Okay, back to the broader conversation. Are there other suggestions, additions, edits, subtractions, modifications of the operating procedures that were shared that anyone like to offer?
Hey, Bob, I had a question, one quick question. It talks about making a request for an agenda item within 5 or more days, or more than 5 days prior to a meeting. I think that's totally fair. Do you have a target for when you would otherwise be producing the agenda? And how do you see those overlapping? That is to say, do you anticipate that the members of this committee would wait to see the agenda and make that request? Or are you only going to publish the agenda after that timeline?
Well, so that's a fair question, and I had flagged that in here because, I think the aspiration of to the public as well as the committee is to get the agenda out at least a week ahead of time. So having 5 days doesn't really work so great because then you will have distributed an agenda, and the two committee members can change the agenda before it's gone out. So So I would suggest we make that longer, maybe 2 weeks in advance that folks ask for agenda item. Now, of course, if something's urgent, anyone can ask for agenda. Your Robert's Rules allows you to have a majority vote to change the agenda at the start of the meeting if need be, although it's not ideal in terms of public notice and there should be some urgency. So the way we've been working to date is Chad and I have been meeting with Andy and Sarah about 2 weeks ahead of time to go through a draft agenda, which Andy's then modified and sent out about a week in advance. So that's the calendar we've been on to date. I don't know if Chad or Andy would like to speak to that, but for me, it feels like getting it in 2 weeks in advance would be good. And certainly anytime in a meeting like this, at the end, we've got the wrap up. And that would be a good time too for someone to say, here's something I'd like to see at the next meeting or a future meeting as well. But eager to hear from Chad and also Andy on the timeline issues there.
Yeah, Bob, I would just second exactly what you just said. 2 weeks is a little, well, it's more workable as far as getting the agenda out. I also like the idea of bringing up agenda items during our Q&A discussion at the end of the meeting. But if something's comes up in the in-between time, 2 weeks, I think is reasonable.
Yeah, I agree with that. You know, especially Bob, with what you mentioned that, you know, if there's an urgent request, we can try to facilitate the best we can, especially with the public. But yeah, usually when I send them out to the committee a week in advance, I'm posting it that same day. That's when it is published.
Okay, thanks for that. Other comments on the operating procedures? Questions or requested modifications?
I'll just say one more thing on the agenda. Having it posted a week early does also help with public participation because they're able to see what's going to be discussed and allow them to prepare. And so the 2 weeks early gives Andy the opportunity to work the agenda items in, and then for the public to see what is going to be presented.
Thank you, Chad. Other comments on operating procedures? Okay, well then I would suggest there's still time if you have comments from small edits to more substantive matters to send to Andy. But in any case, I think as the OAR conversation moves forward, including today, we'll be able to import some language to get some consistency across the documents. And I think we should then be ready to approve the operating procedures at the next meeting. So, okay, well, with that, I'll close up that operating procedures discussion and let's go on to the discussion of the OARs. Andy, I think you maybe have some slides to help move that along.
They should be on there right now.
Yeah, good. So I guess I'd like to open this up. Well, I first want to, including on operating procedures, but also the OARs, thank the members of the committee who spent time working with Andy to improve these. We've got some key points of discussion here that I think have come up in the conversation. And the first one we've got there is strategic funding and regular grant funding. There's been interest in the committee in what we've been calling direct funding, which I think we took to mean acting in a way that's more urgent somehow, or the committee directly recommending things with a less extensive process. But certainly all the committee can do in the end is recommend funding to the commission who makes the decision. We're certainly not authorized to actually direct the funds themselves. So the language we've developed there that you saw hopefully in the draft OARs was strategic funding. That's more for rolling funding over time that someone can come to the committee for. Something that's more urgent, that can help complete a project or a larger project versus the regular grant funding cycle, which I think we anticipate will be the place most funding requests go. But I think we need a little bit to spend a little time here to hear what the committee thinks about this distinction, and in particular, what differentiates them so that someone would know that I should go to one rather than the other? And in particular, what the criteria would be for what we're calling strategic funding here in and there are some criteria, I think, in the OARs that Andy shared. Chad, I see you got your hand up.
Thanks, Bob. I think it's important to note that when we say strategic funding, what we mean is applications that are coming to us outside of the standard competitive grant process. And that the three components I think are critical here, and we can develop metrics, is scale, urgency, and impact. And we can decide what the metrics should be for those, but these should not be just standard grant applications, and they're outside the competitive process. So they should be of a large scale, high impact, and urgent, that they can't wait for the competitive grant cycle. That's all I've got.
Heath?
Well, this is one of the ones I wanted to grapple with some myself today. And there's like a lot here that I hadn't focused a great deal on. And Andy, nice work teeing up that section 2 there. That I think helps that preamble. I think the question for me, and I can give an example that maybe highlights, is what kind of projects do we want going through this strategic program? I had anticipated, I suppose, I think there's a pretty good argument. I can't claim I'm 100% invested in this, but I think there's a pretty good argument that the really big projects that are going to soak a lot of our budget should go through the ordinary process, the ordinary scoring process, and that kind of gives us time to sell it, to, this is going to be a flagship that we put in our report to the legislature, that we fully understand kind of all of the parties that are involved and the nature of their participation, and that, the flagship programs, in my view, would go through section 3. And then in section 4, these strategic grants would be, again, I had thought, that we would have a cap, and, to the contrary of like 1D there, but like have a cap in terms of the size of a project that we would be willing to shove through the strategic grant program path. Now, I'm open to conversations about this, but from my perspective, I just didn't want like some big $15 million thing that was going to be our flagship project for this program in a biennium, like not go through the ordinary process. It might also make other applicants feel a little short shrifted if somebody, because they knew somebody inside of ODF and W, was able to get fast tracked. That I start getting a little uncomfortable with that.
Kristen, I see you have your hand up, but if you'll indulge me, I just want to ask Heath a quick question. What do you see as more the criteria for the strategic ones then, rather than why wouldn't everyone just go through the regular process? What would we want to do?
Well, I think I like having the regular process being the default. In my view, the strategic funding is, we had the Hood River blew out the fish gate, and you've got sediment pumping into the stream, and there's some kind of catastrophe that, like, we could help make it a better recovery and a faster recovery to mobilize some cash there, and that would help some of the covered species. I'm just like making that up, but I had anticipated it would be like kind of concrete specific actions that had more urgency associated with them.
That's helpful. Kristen, and then Chad.
On the spending threshold question, one of the conversations we had is that we don't want to have a bunch of small grants coming through this process, which then become burdensome on the review team or the committee, and ultimately the ODFW commission to approve. So our thought is that these strategic investments would be, I agree with you, Heath, they shouldn't take $15 million of the fund without competing with other projects, but they should also be sizable enough to justify the additional outlay of time, resources, and consideration. to warrant that. And so I think, at least in my mind, I was envisioning projects that are a little bit bigger in scale, and I don't know exactly what to set as a dollar threshold. And maybe that's something we adjust through time, depending on how many of these requests we get. But I just wanted to put that out for consideration, that I am inclined to actually have a floor on the amount that they're asking for, to justify that exercise. And then secondly, it shouldn't be that a project comes through because they know somebody at ODFW. That would also be concerning. This has to be something that's open and available to anyone and everyone that feels they have a justified project to bring forward. I did suggest that we require a pre-application conference with ODFW staff. Some of the other agencies do that for their programs. And I think it's just really helpful, because staff then can review the criteria for eligibility of funding and things like that in advance, and then save applicants from putting a bunch of time into a proposal that's not going to go anywhere, and make sure that, they're really well aligned with the criteria that we set. So those were a couple of thoughts I had that I just wanted to offer.
Thank you, Kristen. Chad, and then Mark.
Just to Heath's point, should we start talking about some numbers as far as a cap that we would want projects not to exceed? And to Kristen's, projects must also be of a certain size to be considered. I think we all agree that it needs to be urgent, that it cannot wait for the competitive grant cycle. And then impactful. Heath's example would be very impactful. And although something may be urgent and of the right scale, if it's not going to be impactful for the covered species, or at least not very impactful, maybe it's still not appropriate for that strategic funding. So I guess I'll just propose maybe we say 10% annually will be allocated to that. So $1 million for these emergency type issues. And then since we get to hang on to those funds, if we don't use it, if there is no strategic request, then we don't let the pool of money get larger than, say, $2 million. So if we've got 2 million in the bank for something like this, we don't continue to add 10% each year into that. We just add more to our competitive grants.
Mark, and then Andy. I think you're on mute, Mark. Maybe we can go to Andy while Mark's on the unmuting there. Andy?
Real quick. I was just responding to Chad's point with some insight about being weary about specifically noting a percentage in the OARs. We can always define that in other documents, so we don't tie our hands. Although I do think it's important, but we can always adjust that in our other documents, because if we do say 10% of the OARs, if we want to change that in the future, we're going to have to go through rule revision. That was all I was going to say for consideration.
Would that be more appropriate than in operating procedures, Andy?
Yeah, operating procedures. We can also, as we work through this grant program, we could release something in the beginning of the year about, or in our expenditure fund, expenditure document framework. Thank you, Sarah. Again, the last part of that. In the expenditure framework yearly, we could update it too. And that way we can paint those pictures to applicants a little bit more clear. And it changes on the priority. And also, because of that, say this year we're going to do 5 million in strategic funding. If we don't spend that 4 or 5 million, we can essentially choose to roll that over, in my opinion, as it stands, into the regular funding by the end of the year, if that makes sense. A little bit more flexibility.
Very helpful.
Mark,
thank you.
Stern, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I guess I would go back. I think what resonated the most with me so far is Heath's comments. I think urgency is really the key part about going outside of a regular grant cycle. Without, an urgency could be the situation Heath described, or it could be somebody has a funding opportunity with some federal funds that have to be used within the next 3 months or committed to, and so there's a a funding reason to consider it sooner rather than later. So that resonates strongly with me. We haven't talked much, or at least I haven't heard much conversation about what are grant limits in the regular funding cycle. What are we looking at there? Is there a floor? Is there a cap? And so without that, I don't really know how to think about the strategic ones yet, but I'd really be reluctant to, I think we should create the opportunity for strategic projects, but I'd be hesitant to mandate it in the OARs. I think we're still on a learning curve here, and I guess I would just have the possibility of the strategic funding, but not make it a path that we know we're gonna dedicate a certain amount of money to. Again, I'd really lean on the regular process whenever possible, unless there's sort of a cause for urgency.
I've got Heath, Andrew, and Andy in the queue.
What about, I was thinking of like maybe like a narrative standard where, and I don't know if it would go in one, maybe it would go as another primary sub, but it would say something to the effect that, you know, strategic grants will not meaningfully reduce the opportunities for participation in the regular grant program, in the regular grant program or something like that. You know, again, this is the commission speaking to the department and the MAC, and I think that the statement should be something along the lines of, you know, strategic grant funding will be designed and approved in a manner that will not meaningfully reduce the opportunities or something like that available through the regular grant program.
Andrew Perky.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I like Mark Stern's point about near-term need to leverage the funding opportunity. But when we're narrowly thinking about what you brought up, which is essentially...
I'm having a little trouble hearing you. It's a little garbled.
Okay. Sorry about being in a bad place. Is that better if I speak more loudly? Okay, I'm going to give it a shot, which is typically it would be a crisis situation. I'm not sure how many other funders would respond and make funds available in those crisis situations. It could have implications for the ceiling that we set, depending on the size or magnitude of the crisis, like an example that you just threw out there.
Thank you. You may want to try to drop a comment too in the chat. We had a little trouble hearing you there. Andy, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I was just going to do a quick reminder. It popped in my head when Mark noted it. He was saying maybe we don't, you know, need to define the different grant opportunities. So I just want to remind everyone that if we're setting up precedent, it needs to be in the OARs. So whatever that looks like, we're setting up procedure and precedent. We can't do that in another document. It needs to be in the OARs to some breadth. So that was all I was going to say.
Kristen.
One other thing for consideration that I don't think needs to be reflected in the OARs, but we might want to consider in the expenditure framework is contingency cost increases. So one of the struggles a lot of restoration projects have had lately is the massive inflation of material costs, especially things like steel prices. And so people may come in with a fully funded project that's ready for implementation, and then with the increase in materials costs, not be able to complete the project. So we had a conversation about whether we could offer some sort of some challenges in doing that. So the other thought would be that an applicant could come back through the strategic funding process and justify why those cost increases that were unforeseen have happened, why there's an immediate urgency for them to be able to say complete a project during the in-stream work period or something like that, and seek that modest additional increase in funding to see out a project. I don't know if the group wants to entertain things like that or not, but I know there has been a fair amount of public testimony, like at the OWEB board meetings, with different groups concerned about this issue and the impact it's having on project life cycles and completion dates. So I just wanted to bring that forward as something that could potentially fit under this umbrella.
Thank you, Kristen. I'm going to call on myself now. You know, listening to the conversation, it almost feels to me like a better name for these would be urgent grants. So there's regular grants and there are urgent grants, because strategic, I mean, I hope that our regular ones are strategic as well, frankly. I'm not sure strategic captures what we're getting at here, and the label of urgent might do better. Just want to note, I'm hearing a couple things. One is the case Heath mentioned, which I certainly found compelling, which is there's a new harm of some sort that has developed. And then others sound also could be urgent, and that's like an opportunity lost. That is, you know, 90% of the money's in the bank and it's going to be lost. And if we could top it off, or a project would be completed, but for material cost increases, like Kristen noted that there's some urgency about. But in cases, urgent ones, we're going to need applicants to need to demonstrate why they can't just go to the strategic grants, pardon me, the regular grants. It's going to need to be clear to us why that's the, why they're not just using the default process, which I think we should. Heath, you're next. Andrew, I see, Perky, I see your hands up still. Did you want to try to chime in again? Oh, no. Okay. Well, you may want to try and lower your hand if you can. Let's go to Heath.
So, two thoughts here, and this applies to the rest. One, like, I'm looking at the timeline for the rulemaking here, like, for all of these items we're about to discuss, and we've got to kind of got to hustle, I suspect. Do we need to make like affirmative decisions today? Is today the day? Do we have another meeting where we're going to review additional language in response to these comments?
Yeah, so thank you for that, Heath, and I'm sorry I didn't offer that clarification to begin with. Looking forward, I think Andy may speak to this too in the timeline. The answer to the question is no, we do not have to decide today. We need to try to advance the conversation. This document still needs to go through ODF&W and ODF&W leadership to have them give a close look at it. So I'm hopeful, looking ahead, that we can give us some good comments today. It then, over the next 2 weeks, get a good look from ODF&W, and then there's time for one more round of a couple of the committee members to look for it before it comes to us in May. If we can approve it in May, we'll be able to stay on the August approval timeline for later in the year. So
okay,
no,
okay,
be decided.
That's fine. That's good news then. So the two items that I really like is I like the idea of styling these as urgent investments. And again, I would like, and maybe it's like, you know, no, not that it will not substantially reduce the funding or funds available through the regular grant program. Like for me, we'll do these and we'll consider them if they're urgent, but we don't want it to compromise the overall program and kind of our regular process and, you know, the deliberate process we are going to pursue in deployment of these monies. I think those two factors would be really important to include. And then Kristen, to your comment about, you know, like a minimum, I don't know if there's an elegant way to narratively say that. We could actually just put it in there and say that we anticipate prioritizing larger projects, you know, in this program that will ease administration and burden on the staff. Consider also that we could offer additional points in scoring projects up to some maximum, right? Given the size of the project. And it may be that we could handle that there in the expenditure framework.
Okay.
Can I respond to Heath, or do we need to stay in order?
No,
just because I think it'd be easier. I think that's fine. And I actually think for the OARs, we probably don't need to say anything about that. That could be something we could revise in other places, and we can just see what we get. And if it becomes this huge burden that's problematic, make adjustments at that point in time to our scoring criteria or something like that. I was really just suggesting that I didn't want to have an arbitrarily low ceiling on the program, but I would be inclined to leave it
Agreed.
open in the OARs and then we can adjust as we have to. Thanks. Sorry
Very good.
to go out of order.
That's all right. Thank you. Mark Stern.
Yeah, sort of following up on Kristen's thinking there. I wonder if in the OARs, we just want to say something generally, as I suggested in the chat, that says the MAC may establish an urgent opportunities for urgent project funding, as needed. And so that in the OARs we're covered and we can do that, but it's really the expenditure framework where maybe we try and define what that opportunity looks like rather than putting it in sort of statute at this point.
Sarah, and then Chad.
Yeah, just wanted to follow up. I appreciate this whole conversation and I like where it's headed. So thank you for this robust discussion of was strategic grants now maybe urgent grants. I wanted to go back to Kristen's point just for the sake of clarification. I fully appreciate your comment, Kristen, that this shouldn't be a project that comes through because they know someone at ODFW. It should be open to all. But would I be correct in that, much like ODFW could be an applicant in the regular grant funding process, ODFW could come forward with one of these urgent grant requests and be considered much the same as any other applicant? But what you're saying is this shouldn't be an opportunity that's exclusive to ODFW.
Yes, I was just saying there shouldn't be some process that it's all about who you know that you get your application in, but rather it should be equal opportunity to all eligible applicants. Yes.
Great. Thanks.
Let's try to wrap up the urgent conversation if we can, because we have other urgent topics to touch on. Chad, I think you're next. And Mark, I do see your hand is still up if you wanted to speak as well. Chad.
I'd just like to support the same things, that a lot of this, floors and ceilings can be discussed in the framework, and we can rely on Andy and Sarah to help figure out what should be in the OARs and what's more appropriate for the expenditure framework. I agree with the urgency stuff. And then Bob, if you don't mind, could you read Andrew Perky's comment out loud? It looks like we have some people joining us on the phone, and maybe they can review the meeting afterwards, but given that Andrew's audio isn't cooperating, maybe just for everybody, you could read it.
Do you mean the I'm not sure many funders comment? Was that the one you mean? Or?
Yeah, that's the one, and that's the one he was trying to convey before he was
right. I'm not sure many this is from Andrew Perky. I'm not sure many funders will fund a response to an urgent need crisis, as in he's hypothetical. So we might be one of the only or few funders to consider private providing funds. That might implicate the discussion on floor and ceiling amounts. So important there. And I think I'll just add for myself from the PFA discussion we've had in the past, or from the author's perspective, from mine at least, we hoped that there would be flexibility in the use of these funds to meet things like urgent needs, or that's why we did not require a match, for example, and we did not restrict it only to certain land types or types of projects initially, because we wanted to have some flexibility there. So that seems to be consistent with Andrew's comment on the fact we may be one of the few funders to be able to meet certain needs. Okay, if we may move on to the next topic, which is project types. I think these were at, let's see, which section were those in? I think there were several of them noted. The question there is really if we want to restrict the funding to certain project types. This is at the bottom of section 3, the top of page 3, allowable project types, development, stakeholder engagement, planning, design, implementation, a combination. And these were in the regular grants. Any comments or thoughts? Another possibility is we don't speak to project types in the rules, although we may say more about them outside of the rules in the expenditure framework. But there's a question about whether we keep these, change them, develop them somehow. I see a hand raised here. Jennifer Weichel, please.
Yeah, what's the purpose of having this language in here? As opposed to not having it in rule and having the project types targeted in a more of a RFP?
I don't know myself. I prefer the RFP. It feels to me if we put it in rule, then we're gonna need to describe pretty specifically the criteria for meeting each of those types and what constitutes those types. I'm not sure we want to spend that energy in the rule on that. But if anyone else wants to add and Mark, I see you've got your hand up as well.
One consideration of just having it in the rules, again, is, someone can pick up these rules and it can be a standalone document and they can have an understanding of the grant program. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, Jennifer, but that hopefully that gives some insight as if we want to put these in there or not. But that's, as we're developing these rules, just remember that hopefully they can pick these up and just get the intent of the grant program. That's all I wanted to say.
I guess as a follow-up, when I look at this, I think, I'm on this group kind of not only from my agency lens, but the HCP lens. And this program is supposed to be about mitigating or offsetting take for the covered species. And so when I see this list, immediately my brain goes to, well, how are these types going to meet that target? And it just doesn't jive for me. So I agree. If we keep it in, we got to define the terms and explain why they're pertinent.
I've got Mark, Kristen, and then Chad. Mark Stern.
Yeah, I guess my first thought was, and I don't know if it's been talked about, but I could also see a needs assessment being something that could be valuable to this process here to figure out what are the projects that are highest priorities to do it. But listening to the last couple of comments, in some ways, I would lean on the side of not defining them here. I think, even though I get your point, Andy, that it helps somebody pick it up and see what's there, but you almost potentially exclude something unintentionally if you put things in. And sort of, Jennifer, to your comment, I don't know what development even means here, allowable project types development. So I guess thinking out loud, if it's possible, I'd be more inclined not to try and define them here, but rather define them in the expenditure framework or even in a specific RFP if we were moving that way.
Kristen and then Chad.
I think I agree with both Mark and Jennifer, but I guess my agreement manifests with a little bit different language. And I'm sorry, I don't have the OARs open, so I'm not sure what words were used there. But one of the subcommittee conversations I was a part of talked about the appropriate use of these funds being, engagement with the stakeholders that you specifically need to do a project, developing that project, meaning design, engineering, permitting, and then implementing the project. And I do have an interest in setting some boundaries around that scope of work for this program. Because some of the other things that have come up are questions about, would research be appropriate for this? Would general education be appropriate? And I think that given the intent is specifically to mitigate impacts for the covered species under the HCP, we want to be careful that we don't, delve too far out of activities that are directly intended to achieve that mitigation. And things like the research or the monitoring, I believe, live in that science team side of the programs that were established under the PFA. So, I don't know that I have a super strong opinion on whether this shows up in the OARs or just in the expenditure framework or something like that. But I do think it's important that we put some boundaries around what types of activities should be funded and may not be eligible for funding.
Chad.
I think Kristen's point is well taken, that it would be helpful to have sideboards on what types of projects we're going to consider. But I also understand what Jennifer is saying, and I'm wondering if it's best that we just say up an the project type must be a project that offsets take of the covered species from the covered activities. And that, I think, gets us there without being too limiting, but does provide some guidance to Andy's point that if you were to pick this up, you see what kind of projects we're looking for. Projects that offset take of the covered species from the covered activities.
I don't disagree with you. I'm calling on myself with my hand up. I don't disagree with you, Chad, but I do think some of it may be a little more indirect. And I think that's what Kristen was getting at, like stakeholder engagement. We may have somebody who's doing direct outreach to a particular landowner type or in a particular area that we think it's especially important to engage in mitigation activities. But that's not the actual mitigation activity itself. That's the prelude to it. And so we need to discuss if we want to be able to if we want to fund something like that work. But sometimes that's a critical piece in getting anything done, is that kind of landowner engagement. To me, that's different from something like general education, which I think, from my view, were most certainly that would be too indirect, I think, in terms of providing mitigation. So, yeah, just want to offer that. Other comments, and I just want to note we've got about another half hour for the OARs before we go to the timeline discussion, and we've got several other things to touch on, but we're doing fine. Any other comments on the project types question?
There is in the chat, Bob. Kate was.
Can you read it, please? I'm having a little trouble
yeah.
watching the chat and the hands raised. Thank you.
If anyone feels strongly about mentioning project types in the OARs, perhaps it could say something to the effect of the project type must be consistent with the conservation strategy of the HCP or something similar.
Yeah, and certainly the PFA report talks about a variety of types of activities, but it doesn't get at things as much like stakeholder engagement as a potential activity. Okay, well, let's set that aside now. I think we all agree there's room in the RFPs to discuss this. The question is really whether we leave it elevated in rule or not. All right, let's go on to the next topic, eligible applicants. The rules now speak to a variety of prohibitions that are in state law as to types of applicants, but we don't, I think one place this conversation went was whether, for example, a private corporation could apply or whether it should be restricted to nonprofits or government entities. And my impression is where the discussion went was that we did not want to put sideboards really on the eligibility. So it doesn't speak to them now, but we wanted to include this as a topic for discussion. And Heath, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just was like, I think it would be helpful to frame this conversation in terms of what kinds of applicants would we think would be ineligible. And I just can't think of any category that I would like to exclude uniformly, whether they're private corporations or non-landowning entities. I can think of examples in every one of those categories that would be appropriate project applicants. I can't think of any policy basis. And, you know, I had heard before some discussion of potential conflicts of interest, but I don't like even if it was a company who made money doing restoration projects, right? Like it's a private company and it's their business to do restoration projects. I'm not offended by them bringing a good project to us. I mean, we're all making money. And so I couldn't think of any applicant category that I would be comfortable blanket excluding.
Yeah, the only one I would put in is somebody who had squandered the funds in the past. That's the only category that would be.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, that's fair.
Okay, well, it sounds like unless, you know, obviously we can continue the discussion, but at this point, it doesn't sound like we need to call out specific applicants besides those that are already defined as ineligible by state law for whatever reason. Okay, let's go to the next topic, which is defining the nexus to private forest lands. This is really a where the question. And Heath, I see your hand up.
Yeah, these are like things I brought up in our rule review. I think the example was like my comment was that the object of this program is to benefit the covered species, in my view. I could envision a circumstance where you have a watershed that has a problem vis-a-vis a covered species that doesn't have private forests in it. It's all ag land. And I don't know if that exists, but hypothetically, one could imagine it exists. I don't think it would be smart to exclude projects in that watershed from this program. That is to say, so long as it has the covered species and we're doing good things for the covered species, then I think that is appropriately considered mitigation for the impacts of the activities in the forested watershed. And you, like on the coast, it's not uncommon that these populations have lots of individual streams where the covered species are moving up, coho are moving up those streams. And I could envision a circumstance where we have an opportunity for a good project that will benefit a population of Oregon Coast coho that is not in a forested stream shed, right? That stream itself doesn't have much in the way of private forest in it. And so that comes up in section 8 sub 6. There was a suggestion that all projects requesting funding must occur in a timber impacted watershed with private forest lands. And I think that would be unfortunate. That is to say, I don't think here I think the object of these funds is improving the plight of the covered species such that they can be delisted. And if we have a high quality project that is not in a timber impacted watershed, that we should pursue it so long as it benefits the plight of the covered species. To me, the nexus is the covered species, not the private forest lands.
Kristen and then Chad.
I would just give a wholehearted endorsement to everything Heath just said. I share that perspective, and I think that was the intention of the authors. I would also add, in light of the project types conversation, there is kind of a relationship here. If we're seeing all of the projects that are coming in are in, Southwest Oregon, and we're not addressing any of the coastal streams, and maybe we're particularly concerned about distribution of covered species up there. This program does allow us, at least as designed, to directly try to engage stakeholders in building those projects that we think are a gap for mitigating. So we can, at least we envisioned as we were drafting it, have the ability to seek projects or project types that the committee might feel are necessary to really mitigate impacts. But I don't think we should limit it in the OARs at the outset, but instead be, working for general uplift for the species that are impacted by these activities.
Agreed.
Chad?
First, thanks for that perspective, both Heath and Kristen. I was pushing to have some nexus to private forest lands at a large hydrological unit, not so much that we would exclude projects in farmlands, because as Heath knows and everybody knows, we do a lot of good work up in the timberlands. But if there's a fish passage barrier, an ODOT culvert that is creating a problem low in the system, we should be able to address those with this grant fund. I think the purpose here was to not have too many projects happening on entirely national forest owned watersheds. That is to say that at no point in that watershed is there any private lands, and it flows right out to the ocean because there's no covered activities happening on those lands. But when you frame it as any benefit to the covered species is generally uplifting them, and hopefully they can become delisted, I understand where you're coming from there. So I'm comfortable removing that nexus to private forest lands as long as everybody's on the same page.
And that's an amazing example I hadn't thought of. Like I personally, though I suspect others might disagree with me here, personally, I would be comfortable excluding the Forest Service entirely, but they just seem they should spend less money blowing up other countries and more on Forest Service lands.
Yeah, I agree, Heath. I just can think of examples where you could have projects being brought to us for fish passage or things like that, where there is national forest land or federal ownership in the entire watershed from headwaters to the ocean.
It seems like there's some agreement that it's benefit to the species that's the driver. I do assume, just for clarity's sake, we're talking about within the state of Oregon.
Yes.
You probably won't be funding something in Washington, even though there may be a common population of salmonids, for example, that benefits. Other comments on that question, the location? Sarah and Andy.
If there is some interest in pursuing a sideboard to like prevent funds from going to a fully federally owned watershed, we would need to flesh out kind of the scale. Because, you know, if you go down to a small scale, it will be just federally owned. And so what is that scale at which you're making that determination? We haven't contemplated anything like that in the rules thus far. So not sure if that's just maybe further discussion more appropriate in the context of the expenditure framework or in the grant criteria or something like that. But that's just a detail that you would have to figure out if you want it to be in the OAR.
Kristen, Andy, did I see you? Did you want to get me?
No, yeah, but you brought up the point because the idea of bordering watersheds that might request funding. That's just, you know, something that could come up, but you brought it up anyways, and it seemed like there's consensus not to for that. That would be spent in the state of Oregon.
Kristen.
Thinking about Sarah's comment, I feel like that might be something we could address through the funding criteria or the expenditure framework, but you know, potentially there's some bonus points if it's directly associated with a particular private timber harvest or something. I don't know exactly what wording we would want to choose, but I think it might be easier to incentivize projects where we want than have a blanket exclusion across project types that show up in the OARs.
Jennifer.
Yeah, I'm kind of getting into the weeds here. I've definitely appreciated all this conversation. You guys have said most of the stuff I was gonna comment on in this section, but just one thing, if whether it's in the RFP or in rule, as we're talking about private forest lands and HCP, just a question for the group to maybe consider using the HCP terminology of covered lands, which expands it slightly beyond private. I know the program's set up so anybody can apply. So for me, it's just a terminology thing to be consistent with HCP language. I'll just throw that out as an idea.
That sounds appropriate, and I hope you'll flag for Andy any place in particular you see that covered lands would be a better fit than the language we're using. Other comments on the location issue? Okay, I think I'm hearing some consensus on that really benefit to the species, although we may want to take a closer look in the expenditure framework of the RFP in terms of potentially prioritizing some locations over others, i.e. entirely federally owned watersheds, which of course gets us into the question of what scale of watershed are we talking about? So, but in case no need for it in the rule. Additional definitions needed. I don't have much to say here. I don't know if anyone has something in the definitions framework. I have some smaller comments that I think I'll just share separately with Andy. You know, some edits and clarifications and language tightening, but Are there other topics here to bring up, either additional definitions or general questions, topics, other things people wanted to flag in this section of the meeting on the OARs? Chris, Alan, please.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I just wanted to flag in my review of this, I had a number of edits to section 5. So I'll forward those on to you, Andy. And we'll just go from there. Just some redundancies and some potentially confusing language around translocation, establishment of new species, etc. I think that could be cleaned up a little bit.
I'm sure it could, Chris, though I'm equally sure that the authors of the HCP handbook could have used your input on their drafting as well, because I think we cribbed this directly out of there. But I'm not offended by that being improved personally.
All right. Nor I. So thank you for that, Chris. Other comments, sections anyone wants to draw our attention to, or things to add that feel like a more substantive that need attention here? Okay, well then I'm going to thank you all for your engagement on this topic. Expressed my delight that we're a little bit ahead of schedule. And just to reiterate next steps, I think it's about working with Andy to convey anything. So if you've got things to send him, please try to get those to him as soon as possible. He'll also work through, of course, the things we talked about today, work a little bit with some of the individual committee members who have been engaged. And then it really is a matter of ODF&W and DOJ getting to work to improve this text and flag anything they see as problematic. I see Heath, Andy, and Mark Stern with hand raised. So Heath, please.
I was just going to set some expectations if I could. Like, some of this drafting is not, in my experience, styled in the way that rules are typically drafted. I fully anticipate that while we have the substance here and the meaning of what we want to capture, and you're going to modify it a little bit, I would encourage people to not be too surprised if when Erin gets her hands on it, or whoever ODF&W's rule writing expert is, that kind of some of the sentence structure and the approach to this changes as well. I think we're going to this is what always happens to me. I draft things like a contract attorney, and I'm sure, Andy, it's just intuitive to draft in that manner, and turns out that rule writers don't draft that intuitively. So I just set some expectations there.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. Andy, and then Mark.
I mean, yeah, he kind of took the words out of my mouth. I was just going to say, expect some changes when we do send it to the people that are kind of the gurus with the rules. And Bob, you mentioned that timeline. We do have a meeting next Friday with the working group for the OARs. I'll get some edits this week, and I hope to begin routing it internally. We'll work with the working group, get it to the DOJ. But yeah, expect some updates.
And Mark Stern.
Well, Andy may have partly spoken to my comment and question, but just to be clear on the timeline for maybe those of us not on the subcommittee, when to get feedback to Andy, and then when we might all expect to see the combined feedback turned around to all of us to respond to.
Yeah, I can follow up on that. So if as soon as possible is always great for feedback. We do have the working group next Friday. I do hope to make the edits after this meeting today, and begin to route it end of next week is what I'm looking at.
When you say Friday, do you mean the day after tomorrow or 10 days from now?
10 days. Thank you. Next Friday. So if you could get me your edits, I guess early next week would be preferred.
Okay.
Please, definitely can take the weekend and the next few days, but yeah, early to mid next week would be preferred.
And just to the ODF&W staff here, we certainly could use your help nudging this along through your process so that we have the best product we can come the May meeting, where we hope to have the approval done. So to stay on the August timeline. All right, let's move to the next topic, which is one we've just been touching on here, which is the overall timeline for the various materials we're producing. So Andy, to you again.
All right. And thanks again for that great discussion, everyone. And thanks to the working groups for really just taking the time to work together in the last few weeks. It's been a lot of work, a lot of great ideas swirling around. But I just want to say I'm very much appreciative of it, of your time. So I'm going to flash up here. I sent you guys all a document. Feel free to follow on your own if you have it open. Here's an updated timeline. It should be on your screen now in a PDF form, correct?
Yeah, but pardon me, you'll need to zoom in quite a bit if you can to help with. Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
So I'm going to kind of, move through this timeline relatively fast. Well, kind of not fast, but this is very different than what you guys have seen previously. You actually saw a timeline. This is a result of, a department priority, which is this PFA program, to help streamline this stuff and really outline, what's in front of us to get this program stood up. And this is a result. It's a work in progress. You'll see there's still to be determined dates, of course, depending on OAR adoption and all that other stuff we've been talking about today. But we just kind of wanted to lift the curtain a bit to show what's been going on. So you'll see, there's a lot of this status stuff that's kind of a rainbow of color, but I'm a big color person when it comes to staying organized. And we've gotten some of this already done. So operating procedures, we're working on that now. Obviously, we will be moving that to the next meeting. We're working on the grant evaluation criteria now with that working group. Expenditure framework, we're also working on that currently. Drafts are pretty much developed. We're just kind of touching them up. I do believe the next meeting with the chairs, we'll probably talk about when we want to share those documents with the whole committee and have a discussion. This is, you've seen this before. Sorry, it got split on 2 pages, but the OARs and the timeline for submissions as we're moving through it. Really May 16th is when we're looking at. Around that date we'll be submitting. So that'll be hopefully after our next meeting. And if we do push it a month, of course, these dates just move a month accordingly. But this is the timeline you're looking at where everything gets routed for that. So that's all pending as we update our stuff. And then, of course, it all leads to that August 4th date, if not that September date. But that's the final one for the OARs. You've seen the grant solicitation and applicant materials packet. That's what I reviewed last meeting, I believe, to some extent. All these documents are essentially what will be included in that grant solicitation when we do offer it later this year. So this is what, we'll post on the website. Solicitation's live. This is pretty much everything that an applicant's going to need for the most part. I hope to have this discussion with the committee or working group probably first, and then the committee in summer. So I'm really looking forward to insight as what's left off of this. What else do we need? But yeah, this is hopefully what an applicant can pick up or download. And it says everything about the program, and we'll update stuff yearly in it. That's where we'll update our priorities in it. We'll talk about project types in it. A lot of the stuff we were talking about needing additional details that may not work in the OARs could go into this solicitation. So there's just some of those documents. Again, I hope that we can start working on that after we get over the OARs. That's kind of the next big thing on my mind, but we'll work with the chairs to talk about that timeline, of course. Grant agreement templates. So I'm working on that now. As I said before, usually I'm about 2 or 3 months trying to get stuff ready for the committee ahead. But we have to work on 2 different kinds of templates. So there's been a request to do advancements. So I am working on advancement template language. And then, of course, the standard reimbursement template language. And there's a few exhibits that come with it, just your standard, grant exhibits that go into agreements that are executed. But how that works is we create them, internally route them. I'm using templates. I'm not creating something new as we've been doing for a lot of this program. So, we're not recreating the wheel. A lot of the stuff we're using is from OCRF and other similar grant programs internally and externally. We're route it internal, though, for some review. We'll then get it most likely to the DOJ, I believe. I could be mistaken, but I do think it needs to get to the DOJ to approve the template agreements, especially since we're talking about advancements. That would presumably be pretty large advancements when they are requested, then of course approval. Dates to be determined, but of course, you know, I have that September goal date, right? Because we're looking at September, October, November to launch. We have objective 2 here, to implement a grant management system, an interim grant management system. So as we've discussed previously, we do want to get a shiny, great, streamlined grant management system to help us work through our grants as we get them. You know, I'm expecting a pretty high volume of grants because this is a unique opportunity statewide. And so we're exploring procurement on that. We're going through the whole process, of course. That's down the road, though. That's not going to be until later next year because we have an entire process for RFPs and to make it equitable for what we choose. But in the meantime, we are exploring an interim system. I am working on that now. I'm looking at some of ODFW's other grant management systems and hoping that we can adapt that. So I should have an update in summer. I'm working with our IT people currently to actually create a bare bones system by the end of summer for you guys to look at and get some feedback on. That would probably be another working group initially. But yeah, identify the needs, tools, and set up and configure. Dates to be determined, of course. And then post our grant solicitation, right? So this is everything that leads up to the launching of it. So we got to establish the web page. Well, that's already established. You know, but we got to make it a little bit more robust. I'm going to add a document library and everything. As we start adopting stuff, that web page is going to become much more robust in the coming months. A great resource, and it will paint a better picture of what the PFA mitigation is, how it fits into the larger PFA program, and who it works with. You know, we need to have the solicitation reviewed by the MAC, which I just showed you guys a little bit higher up. That is drafted, but we have to review and edit it. And we have to adopt the solicitation. Then we have to do public notice, right? You know, we want to get the public involved. We want to get their comments. We also have to do media announcements, press releases, email. So I'm starting list servers now to get that process ahead of time. I am working with our PR group to be able to get a message out and start creating list servers so people are notified about these meetings and about when we launch the opportunity. The last thing we want, you can't make up good PR, right? I mean, when the opportunity passed, it passed. So we want to be able to have a lot of applicants apply to this and know about this program. Of course, standard public webinar 1 month before, and then we launch that solicitation. And this is the process to award grants as of now. And just note, we are working legal to better define these subtasks. And there may be more as we figure out that process, because this is a historic program for the department. It's one of the biggest we've had, so we're working to facilitate it. But yeah, this is what it's looking like. You know, you'll review submitted grant applications, we'll compile them, hold kickoff meetings with review teams, review and score with the MAC and technical review teams, we'll rank submitted grants, we'll make recommendations to the committee. You know, we hold MAC meetings. We'll do project approval by the commission. We'll then develop grant agreements at that point. Remember, the template should already be approved by now, but we still have to develop individual grant agreements for who's awarded. They get reviewed by legal. Depending on how big those are, they might go to DOJ if they hit a threshold, which I believe is over $250K, around there. We execute them, and then we disperse grant funds through the establishment of cost codes. So just to define that a little bit more, that's when we believe we'll be able to successfully tell legislature at that point, we have expelled the money. We've created cost codes for these programs, because a lot of this is going to be reimbursed, right? So sometimes we might not have all the money out the door until 2 or 3 years down the road. But when we establish those cost codes, that's us financially saying, you know, this project's funded for this amount of money. So that's probably when we're really showing that metric of success to legislature and others. And then, of course, the last objective, which will be next year, is to get that full-fledged grant management system procured. So that's a bit of a pathway to get through that. You know, something that the department will be working on internally, requires its own RFP and a few other things. But yeah, that's kind of a fast and furious discussion of what we have to come. Sorry, there's a lot of talking at you guys, but hopefully that made some sense. I'm open up for any questions you guys may have. Remember, a lot of this is tentative, but please, that's all I really wanted to touch on right there.
Well, thank you for that, Andy. It's certainly a large volume of material and various steps, and it's I'll need to do some digesting of it all. I think that I'm hoping that many of these documents you need to produce already exist elsewhere in ODF&W or in OWAB and sister agencies, a variety of contractual and grant type agreements, so that there's not a lot of having to create things new, but instead just modifying for our purposes. Is that correct? I'm hopeful there.
Yes, adapt and modify is my slogan as best as I can. So yes, 100%.
Can you just give us a quick view of like dead ahead next 3 meetings? What the key tasks? Obviously, we finish the operating procedures next time. Yes, sort of what's dead ahead, or maybe you've got that right there.
So yeah, so coming up in the near future here. So thanks for that, Bob. We'll really need to nail down our grant evaluation and what that process looks like. That's going to help guide our solicitation. Expenditure framework, we're wrapping that up with the working group. So we'll probably talk again with the chairs when we want to share that. But really, it's going to be the solicitation and attachments is really the big next steps. I do hope to have a public engagement strategy end of summer to you guys. Don't need to talk about that now, but the solicitation is a big document. So I would love for that to be after the OARs. So maybe next meeting, we recommend setting up a working group to start with that. But does that answer your question there, Bob?
I think it does. I didn't mean to preempt other discussion of the updated timeline as well. So if others want to go back to that or have discussion, let's certainly spend some time on that updated timeline if there are other questions there.
Only comment was just that that's a lot of work over the summer. And in my experiences, people have a way of not being around in the summer.
Yeah.
So good luck, Andy. Go get them.
Well, you guys have all been working great. I mean, Bob's overseas now, Mark's been traveling. So, I think there's a lot of passion and dedication here. And I do appreciate the time. Again, you guys are volunteering and the department really does appreciate the help. I think we can carry some stuff forward. But yes, appreciate that. Good luck.
Yeah, I certainly think the expenditure framework is a next crucial coming up document that'll sort of draw together in a more narrative sense, I think, the variety of steps. Both we'll talk about some of the criteria that are things that are from the report, as well as in the OARs, but also adding to those as well, giving my understanding is that's a bit of a guide for a potential applicant about all the steps that we'll need to follow, and without having all the documents there that they're going to need to follow out. And we'll certainly need to have a robust conversation about how we want to engage in a grant evaluation process and scoring. What role is the committee playing? To what extent do we use technical experts or local experts? And if we do, how does that fit into a timeline? So I definitely see those as important discussions coming up. Other comments on the timeline? Sarah?
Yeah, thanks, Andy, for walking everybody through this. This was presented to you kind of at my urging because we've been working with a team here in ODFW that includes folks from our contracting group and from our business analysts. And so each of these tasks and subtasks has had some careful thought. You'll see all the TBDs, the to be determined dates. I think we'll probably be, Andy has a version of this document that actually has his best guess for where you see TBD, but we didn't want to, it's so tentative. We didn't want to set anything in stone with you today, but I think we'll probably be representing this timeline to you as things get more firm and as we start to better anticipate dates. And I think where this is going to come in really useful is helping us as a collective group set a realistic date for that solicitation. We have a goal, I think, of what was it, September or October? Bob, was that, and Andy, was that right? Yeah.
Yes,
Yep.
that's what we hoped, yeah.
And so you can see the large body of work that has to we have to get through together in order to get that out the door. And so this, I think, will be a good tracker for us to decide whether that's realistic. Does it need to move? Are we on track? So you'll see this again.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments here on the timeline? Okay, well, let's move to the, we're a few minutes ahead of schedule, happily. So let's move to the final closing comments and meeting wrap up. I guess I'll just say thank you all for your engagement today. I feel like we made some good work, made some progress on several topics, particularly on the OARs there. I think we'll be in a better place to now finish off the operating procedures with some of the language modifications, such as the urgent grants versus regular grant language we've developed. Next agenda then we'll hopefully approve the operating procedures and then also get a more refined version of the OARs for approval at the next meeting. And I'm anticipating maybe the expenditure framework is also a more substantive document. Is that right, Andy, for the next meeting?
Right.
That'll be the next meaty thing we have, hopefully with the other two largely done. But again, I want to emphasize we're dependent on ODF&W really getting engaged on those OARs, the staff and DOJ and the leadership there to help us be ready at the next meeting to potentially approve those, which will help us keep the August timeline. Other comments? Anyone like to add topics for next time? Mark Stern, I see a hand raised.
Yeah, I'm just curious if you, Bob, or Andy, or others, maybe it's a preview into the expenditure framework. Has there been much discussion on sort of what is the size of the projects that we're envisioning? I mean, we've talked about a little bit about that with the urgent or strategic projects, but I just wondered generally, are we anticipating, $2 $5 million projects or $100,000 projects, or just have any current thoughts on that, or all to be determined?
Well, I'll just say for myself, the general answer is no. We haven't really talked about it special. I'm pretty certain we're not going to have 1,000 projects, though. Obviously, there's a tension there between multiple projects and just administering them and the time and energy it takes to administer staff-wise projects. So no, I don't. But we could welcome some of that conversation now. We have some time, as well as, of course, thoughts from you, Mark, if you'd like. But I guess my concern would be too many small ones could be a problem, and we may have opportunities to do large projects that other grants may not be able to do. There may be an opportunity there for us. Heath?
I'd be interested in Mark's take on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I guess I don't have a real take on it. I sort of have this vision that there'd be projects in the $100,000 to $500,000 range, but I think until you put the RFP out, you sort of don't know what's going to walk in the door. And I guess it sort of goes to, if there's not a needs assessment, if we haven't identified priorities, it's hard to know what will walk in, and it will vary by the RFP cycle in terms of who's ready to go and what's going on out there. So I think you're right, Bob. You don't want a gazillion small projects, and yet at the same time, I guess if we don't define that at some point, then we'll be just seeing who shows up.
Yeah, I kind of, in the context of this conversation, my comments on a different item, I'm kind of the view that bigger is better in this circumstance, and we could approach it in that context. That is to say, I don't know that we need to have firm expectations. It will kind of depend on what comes in the door, and I admit that my preference in choosing projects is going to bear in mind, and I get it, we're gonna have to grapple with this and the scoring, and this is why I hate all this this kind of bureaucratic approach to teeing them up, and we have to document it. But from my perspective, high quality large projects are better than high quality small projects. And I think it'll make the program more successful and they'll sell better. So that's just my personal preference, and others may have other thoughts. before I move on, I don't know if anybody has any response to that. I have a different topic if folks want to explore this more.
Because I would say, to the extent we're really emphasizing impact, things that have impact at scale, then that's going to be a bigger project, I think, inherently, and more dollars probably associated with it. So to the extent that makes it to the scoring, the extent, and how we're going to measure that, that's a good question, and score that, the size of the impact, but I'd certainly be open to larger projects as well. Other comments on project size? Chris?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's just been conveyed. But as someone that does administer a number of small grants in our office that range anywhere from 20K up to maybe 150, sometimes there's an entity that has a very valuable project that maybe can't qualify for that type of funding through another mechanism, but maybe they only need 20 to 50 or something like that. And it's some projects like that turn out to be some really key conservation actions or some cost share money that really tips a project over the line to implementation. So I guess in my mind, it would be nice to lean toward higher dollar, higher impact actions, but still to reserve the ability to fund some smaller dollar actions as well, depending on the type of project, of course, that comes in and the entity submitting it.
Other comments on this topic about the large and small projects before we turn to Heath's next topic? Okay, we certainly have more time to discuss that. Heath?
Yeah. So I just wanted to make a closing comment that personally, I am very invested in seeing the biggest bang for the buck in expenditure of these dollars. And I hope people take that in sincerely, and particularly in the context of, investments in non-forested watersheds. I really want to be able to evidence that we're doing what's right for the species and as much as possible for the species, given the dollars that we have. One place that I feel like I'm not very well equipped to answer that question, I've been to a number of what I would say is kind of moderate ENGO fundraisers where they're kind of describing data-driven prioritization and finding the best projects for the money. I don't feel very well equipped to tackle that. And I could envision a circumstance where we get a bunch of applications that all kind of come at that question haphazardly. And I just wanted to comment that I'm going to need some help. Like I'm good at a lot of things, but I'm not good at that kind of ways to describe and prioritize projects in terms of their ecological value. And I think that we're going to need that for purposes of selling the program to the legislature and otherwise. And so in that context is just a pitch to say authentically, that's my objective, because I want to be able to show the services that forestry in Oregon is doing excellent things. And two, I need help. And I'm gonna need help from folks. And if I have projects all coming in answering that question in like a million different ways, I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to contrast them in terms of their value. If we've got 10 farmland culvert projects, I'm going to need some help knowing which is the right one to spend the money on. And I don't know that we've grappled with that yet.
Sarah, and then Andy.
An offering to Heath's point is that whether it's our ex officio members and or other ODFW staff that Andy and I could call on, we would be happy to tee up some presentations for you all, some informationals for you all on what the priorities are that are identified in various recovery plans or conservation plans for the covered species. We could do that in this venue and or record some webinars that could be watched at the committee's leisure. But we'd be happy to to coordinate that and pull that together, just so that you all can kind of get some sense for what those conservation and recovery priorities are.
Yeah, like I don't, my job has not required, and therefore I have not committed the resources, for instance, to really understanding like the Wild Salmon Center's business plans for salmon. And I get the sense that and maybe the salmon superhighway thing like have some relativity to answering these questions, but I just don't know. And I don't kind of don't know where to start. And I don't actually want, nobody's going to pay me to be an expert on those issues. And if there's an opportunity between now and the time where we're actually selecting projects for us to get some education on that, I personally would attend. I would find that quite valuable.
Andy? I think you're on mute, Andy.
Oh, no, I did it. I want to echo Sarah's point there about the presentation. Happy to do that. And then to you, Heath, another point of the technical review teams will be able to provide that insight to you, to the committee, as you guys decide on funding. They will, hopefully there will be some local folks there that have that technical advice, and you'll be able to see that feedback as this committee decides on what to fund too. So we're happy to do it on the front end and on the back end as the decision's being made at the same time. That's the true value of getting those boots on the ground bios and whoever else.
And I'd just like to underline Sarah's point that that's a real role for the ex officio folks, to both individually and as a bridge to their agencies, to help us be aware of where they see critical needs and benefits from the menu of projects that come in. Other closing comments on any of these topics, size of topics, other things to add? Okay, well, I will just thank you all again for hanging in there for this 2-hour meeting. Well done. I think we're making steady progress. We all know that there's challenges to do things in the way that quite understandably a transparent public entity requires. So thanks for your patience. I think we're chipping away at it. And obviously you're free at any time to contact me or Andy or Sarah or Chad, any of us, if you've got any comments, concerns. But please get the follow-up on the documents we've been considering to Andy at the earliest convenience, and expect to hear from him as well about keeping the ball rolling. So thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.